We've got a war on the poor. We've got a war on immigrant communities. And if you're going to mount a fight against a system that has for 400 years perfected the method of repression of people that look like me.
In the United States, new report revealing systematic racism in Chicago.
Housing discrimination has left a devastating legacy in the United States. The restrictions on people of color.
In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed to fight the practice of redlining. Now, many predominantly black communities see growth stagnant as appraisers fail to value their homes at their worth.
The real problem that we're dealing with right now is economics. Like Green always says, economics and resources is the biggest obstacle that the African American community is facing on a day-to-day basis, and it ties into a lot of the downfalls that we're dealing with.
When you can invest $100 million into DePaul basketball arena when they can practice at the United Center for free, and $16.4 million into Uptown to build upscale apartments, when you can build these new bus stops we got now downtown, but walk in our neighborhoods and not $1 million is coming. When we walking past boarded up schools, boarded up houses, they knock it down with red X's with no plan to redevelop, mental health facilities shut down, the unemployment rate is the highest in Chicago than it is around the country. When you want to talk about violence, you got to talk about the economics.
Of course, we already know about redlining and how redlining is a big monster and a big obstacle that we have to face on a day-to-day basis where getting a piece of the land is concerned. Honestly, it's no mystery that there's money and power in land.
Structural, institutional, and systemic racism broadly refer to the system of structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantage racial minorities and particularly black people. It refers to the rules, practices, and customs once rooted in law with residual effects that reverberate throughout society, each with their own nuances. A good example of systemic racism is redlining, a system once used by banks and the real estate industry that literally outlined the neighborhoods where people of color lived in red ink. If you lived inside of the red lines, loans were considered risky and banks were less likely to give loans or even invest. The practice was banned in 1968, but the impacts live on, preventing black families from amassing wealth at the same rate as their white neighbors on the other side of that red line.
What do you do with the fact that this house that they could not buy in Bergen County is almost definitely worth $750,000 or even $1 million today, and your family doesn't have it because of nothing more than racism?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of things that we haven't had because of racism.
Yeah.
The house is just a very small part of it.
That's a lot of money, though.
It may be, but you know, money's not everything.
So when you think of this whole story, and you think of your folks here who had all the money they needed to buy a home in one of the hottest housing markets in the country and were denied only because of the color of their skin, what kind of story is this?
I don't know. It's a story of our country.
It's never just housing. It's connected to respectability, health, wealth, and multi-generational wealth. And people whose families weren't allowed that, they don't get to inherit that. So now the average black family's wealth is only 1/10 the average white family's wealth. And all kinds of things that are race neutral. If you look up maps of where people have the biggest college debt, it matches the map of redlining from the 1930s.
So the latest census data show that white home ownership held pretty steady last year at about 74%. However, black home ownership has seen a steady decline from the pandemic peak to about 43% at the end of last year. Why is that gap getting bigger?
Yeah, and one other thing to note there, Karina, is that this gap that's around 31 points right now is actually wider than the gap that existed 60 years ago in 1960 when it was 27 points. So why we're seeing this gap, or rather this decline, right now, I think probably a little bit of an impact from the pandemic. But also we have to say that this gap has existed again for 6 decades. It has been persistent. persistently wide. And I think really we have to look back in history for the answer to that. This is essentially just the cumulative and persistent and ongoing impact of, frankly, discriminatory policies that exist in the housing market.
I'm Jamal Green, a father and finally a homeowner. Growing up, I drove by boarded up houses and buildings with no help from financial institutions to create homeowners. That leaves a community with no stakeholders, schools with less children and resources, and young people with no real hope, just hoping to survive. But now it's time for us to stop surviving and start rebuilding our communities. Imagine a movement that puts you on the pathway to homeownership with a low monthly payment, no matter your income and no matter the price of the home. If your credit is low, it's still your turn. If you're having income problems, it's still your turn. The My Turn to Own movement will put you on the pathway to home ownership today. Because yep, it's just that easy. Go to myturntown.com for more information or give us a call at 877-434-4445. That's 877-434-4445.